Concerning foreign aid, Secretary of State Warren Christopher is joined by the Administrator of the Agency for International Development, Brian Atwood.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here with Brian Atwood and Dick Moose to introduce the Peace, Prosperity, and Democracy Act of 1994. I'll say a few words about the act and then turn the rostrum over to Brian and Dick. The act was submitted to Congress yesterday. It's the result of intensive interagency processes, extensive discussions with members of Congress and their staffs that began about 3 months ago. We've also consulted very widely with interested non-governmental organizations. The Clinton administration is the first to be elected since the Cold War ended. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to adapt our foreign policy to a world no longer dominated by superpower confrontation. Next Monday, I'll be talking about the first truly post-Cold War foreign affairs budget. Today, let me describe how this new statutory proposal also reflects our new foreign policy priorities. We are still operating under the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. That act is a relic of the Cold War, passed a few weeks after the Berlin Wall went up, and geared to our global strategy of containment. On a purely practical basis, some of its provisions are obviously out of date. But foreign assistance itself is not out of date. Our assistance program can help to achieve the fundamental purposes of our foreign policy, enhancing the security and well-being of the American people. Sharply focused aid helps to support democracy and free market institutions. It bolsters preventive diplomacy as we face global problems like narcotics trafficking and environmental degradation. Foreign assistance can give us great economic opportunities. For example, every year we get back in sales to Korea triple the amount of assistance we provided over a decade to Seoul. Interestingly enough, Seoul now has a foreign assistance program of its own to aid others. If our foreign assistance is to serve our interests effectively, it must be targeted on our foreign policy priorities. The new act establishes a framework that does just exactly that. It seeks to encourage sustainable development, to build democracy, to promote peace, to provide humanitarian assistance, and to promote economic growth through trade and investment. The new act will aggressively promote U.S. economic interests, one of our highest foreign policy priorities. Through the act, we will encourage broad-based economic growth, creating dynamic markets for U.S. exports in the developing world, where by the year 2000, 4 out of 5 consumers in the world will live. To take another example, all Americans have a stake in the success of political and economic reform in Russia and the new independent states. The new act enables the President to assist nations that are seeking to join the community of democratic states, not only in Central and Eastern Europe and the new independent states, but in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as well. This administration is committed to helping achieve a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. The new act will help to achieve that goal through programs to bring economic growth to Gaza and the West Bank, and through our continued military and economic assistance for Israel and Egypt. We have also moved global issues into the mainstream of American foreign policy. The core goals of the new act include the protection of the environment and the stabilization of population growth. These core goals, these core global goals, also include human rights. As you know, this week, in another important release, we released our 1993 Human Rights Report. I've been involved in these human rights reports ever since the first one in 1977, and I must say I'm very proud that the State Department is prepared to take, and the United States government is prepared to take, the courageous and quite extraordinary step of releasing a human rights report on 193 countries. I also want to thank you for the extensive coverage you've given to this important document, which I think provides a baseline for measuring measuring performance and progress around the world. I believe that this new act is a sound investment for America. Assistance to the priorities that I've outlined today is highly cost-effective. For example, compare the cost of the infrastructure improvements in Gaza and Jericho with the cost of continued conflict in the Middle East. Compare the cost of support for reform in Russia to the necessary defense expenditures, the necessary increases in defense expenditures that would be necessary if Russia were to revert to dictatorship. Compare the price of population programs with the scourge of starvation. If we ignore these issues, the kind of issues that I've mentioned here today, they will return compounded, more costly, and sometimes deeply threatening to our security. Let me make just one final point about the new act. The Agency for International Development was one of the first laboratories for reinventing government. The Vice President's National Performance Review identified reform of foreign assistance as one of the most critical actions in the field of foreign affairs. The new act responds by making foreign assistance programs more efficient and more responsive. The President and I view passage of this bill as an important step for our foreign policy. We look forward to working with Congress in the spirit of bipartisanship as it debates the Peace, Prosperity, and Democracy Act. Now I'd like to bring on Brian Atwood and Dick Moose to talk in more detail about the act and to answer questions that you may well have about the act that has gone up to the Hill yesterday and which will be the subject of debate up there over the next several months.
Would you stay to take a few questions?
Not today. I'm sorry. I've got a luncheon date and need to get upstairs. Thank you.
Let me just say that we had a discussion with the leadership on Capitol Hill in September, wherein we made a commitment to move the interagency process along so that we could get this bill to the Congress. I think that we did it in record speed. The Secretary personally played a role there in pushing this through the interagency process. And I'm delighted that we were able today to actually introduce the bill formally after an extensive period of consultations with members of Congress. The Secretary has really said it all. I'll just say a couple of words about the hearing we just attended. This hearing really began a process not only of looking at legislation that we have submitted. What it also did was to begin the process of creating a new political rationale in our country for our foreign assistance programs. We had the opportunity in this hearing to make the case that investments in foreign assistance are not only investments in foreign policy, in particular in crisis prevention, but we were also able to make the case that the initiatives that we're undertaking in the fields of environment, population, economic growth, democracy, peacekeeping, non-proliferation have a direct impact on our domestic interests. And in this increasingly interdependent global economy, these interests are well served by these programs, including the fact that we are able to find various cost benefits as a result. In looking at the old 1961 Act, at the beginning of the hearing, I held up this very thick document that's about 6 inches thick at this point, and I said, what has happened as a result of this proliferation of amendments since the 1961 Act, this is it. This is one that's been used by our lawyer, Bob Lester, extensively. And the point I made was that, in essence, this act has made legal advisors as important as policymakers in the executive branch. It has seriously complicated Congress's oversight role in the sense that all of these mandates are blurred. We are now saying through this new legislation that what we're doing is asking you to hold us accountable on the achievement of results. We have often been, as the remaining superpower, unable to respond rapidly to changing events in the world. And this act and and all of its amendments force us to think narrowly about funding sources as opposed to thinking strategically about foreign policy. And finally, it's convinced too many of our people that our foreign assistance programs are designed mainly as international welfare programs that benefit others rather than benefit us. So we tried to make that case today, I think with some degree of success, and we hope to proceed now to the Senate and see both the House and Senate adopt this legislation. Dick?
I had been asked by Secretary Christopher to preside over the final stages of the drawing together of the legislation which has now been proposed to the Congress. My presence there today was to underscore the role of the Secretary of State as the overall coordinator of all of the functions that fall within the International Affairs chapter of the budget. Then to make the point that the 5-6 objectives, priority objectives of the Secretary, as they will be reflected in the budget submission this coming week, the same 6 priorities that are reflected in this legislation. They perform a unifying function that flows down from our policy as enunciated by the President, the Secretary, as reflected in the budget, and now in this bill, which provides a charter and provides new criteria to replace the old single one, which guided the old foreign aid policy and so much of our previous foreign policy. That is the containment opposition to the Soviet Union, now replaced by these 6 objectives of sustainable development, democracy, peace, humanitarian assistance, trade and investment, prosperity, and the advancement of democracy. So that we were there in a mode indicating that this is not just another foreign aid bill. It is a foreign policy bill as well, because the functions of the bill is to support and to further the objectives of our diplomacy, and these tie back in so many instances in the various chapters of the bill to the well-being of the people of our own country. So I think that's about all I would add.
$3.5 billion. Can you put it in figures now?
You'll see that next week when the budget is submitted, but it is going to maintain the status quo.
Under that,
Answer the question of why, if you're bothering to change the rationale, why is there no change in the output? And if there isn't any difference, what difference does it make changing the rationale?
I think that this is a perfect example of what we're trying to achieve in terms of preventive diplomacy. This investment that we have made has helped us avoid war in this region for many years to come. It is also now has us on the verge of seeing a breakthrough in negotiations in this region. And I think that's very significant. It's very important for us to remain steady at this time.
Mr. Atwood, under that funding rationale, then, if Israel and its Arab partners are successful in negotiating peace, it would follow that the level of funding for their aid package would also be reduced. Is that correct?
No, that's not necessarily correct. There clearly will be different needs in the region. We not only could fund those needs through Title III, but we can use sustainable development money to promote development in the region as well, especially in some of the countries that are now actively engaged in the peace process that are not obviously entitled to that sort of consideration under current laws and because of the circumstances of the diplomacy of the region.
You talk about prohibitions on terrorist countries. Could you please define terrorist countries, and can you also explain the presidential waiver, and can this at all impact on aid to Syria?
There isn't anything in this act which would affect our previous definition of terrorist countries. So we're as far as that goes. Insofar as this new act deals with that, it involves restatements of previously existing policy.
Make clear to us what a presidential waiver constitutes, how that works, and could Syria be a beneficiary of assistance under this with a presidential waiver?
I don't see how they could, but I don't want to
I don't want to anticipate a future decision that the department might make, but there's nothing in this that is designed to have that effect to make it any easier than it would have been before.
New rationale of the new act change assistance for Russia and Eastern Europe and the other countries of the former Soviet Union, and what will its practical impact be?
Well, the Freedom Support Act and the Support for Eastern European Democracy Acts were very recently adopted. What we have done since they were recently adopted and remain the policy of this administration and the Congress, and it's a bipartisan policy, we have simply retained those two acts, so there would be no change in the way we run those programs.
This cutting back of welfare, which is what it seems to me, for certain parts of the world. Mr. Moose, since you've served that part of the world once, I wonder whether you can tell me whether the continent of Africa and other developing countries aren't being shortchanged or being cut in favor of promoting democracy and our larger national interest.
No, I wouldn't. I want to be careful not to associate myself with the premise of the question that
Africa is not being cut back.
No, that aid constitutes welfare.
Just listen, that we're changing from an international welfare program to something that is more serves our interest.
No, let me get to
the. Having seen the Secretary of State define what our interest, Africa was well down the line, and since they are apparently the welfare recipients, I'm wondering what it's been doing.
The bill reaffirms in the first chapter reaffirms the administration's support for the African for sustainable development in Africa. It is not a money bill, and so there are not amounts in here. But in the hortatory provisions of the act, we refer to our continued support for the African development funds, for the multilateral banks, under the chapter for the promotion of democracy, and for countries in transition. There is certainly adequate provision in there to enable us to assist a variety of African countries in a variety of situations. And of course, the Sustainable Development chapter has immediate applicability to Africa. Brian has just come back from Africa and might want to add a word on that.
Well, can you tell us whether the amount for Africa, without revealing what it's going to be, is going to be sort of an increase since we're for sustainable development when we see it on Monday?
I think in the particular budget environment we are in, maintaining support for development in Africa at levels equal to last year or even a slight increase will be quite dramatic indication of the administration's commitment. And that's what I think you will see, but you'll have to wait for the budget to be revealed.
I don't know whether this question came up on the Hill, but last year when you were here with Ms. Lynn Davis and you all were briefing us on the discussion draft, one of the things that was going to be, you all were seeking a repeal of country-specific language, like the Pressler Amendment for example, but there was a hue and cry by Senator Pressler, Senator Glenn and others. Is it correct that the Pressler Amendment has been put back in on the bill and would not be repealed? You all will not seek a repeal of the country-specific Pressler Amendment?
That is correct.
Could you elaborate? Was that due to
we said at the time that when Lynn Davis and I were here, and we've said it many other times, that our policy would not change, even though we were trying to take out country-specific references in the bill, country-specific prohibitions. We heard the Congress loudly and clearly on that, not simply through the press, but in our consultations, and we've decided to retain the Pressler Amendment, as well as the Glenn Symington Amendment, which is prohibition against countries that are proliferators of nuclear weapons.
Consulting with Congress, you decided to retain country-specific language in the bill, and are there any other examples of major changes in the bill from those that, from the time that it was presented to us in December?
Yes, we have not included, I don't believe, any other country-specific language, but funds for Title I Sustainable Development have now been walled off. As you recall, there was in the draft bill the provision that allowed us to transfer money among accounts. We have now retained current law that protects sustainable development. Military assistance is capped at the level authorized by Congress. Policy language has been redrafted and strengthened, particularly a lot of language in the introduction of the bill that relates to various activities that are undertaken by private voluntary organizations with AID. Annual authorization provisions have been dropped to focus more clearly on this bill as a charter for the future. That's a very significant. I'm not sure how the Congress will decide to handle the authorization of appropriations. What we've asked for is that they adopt this as a charter piece of legislation. Authority to withhold assistance to countries not fully cooperating with U.S. counter-narcotic efforts has also been included. As a result, this is all the result of the consultations that we held.
Concerning the population control aspects of this bill, isn't there a problem there possibly with regard to the notion of human rights as well as certain moral aspects that you want to reduce the world population to a certain amount and will use foreign aid in order to force other countries who might see otherwise in this to reduce their population as a precondition for receiving aid? Now, the U.S. Declaration of Independence declares that every individual has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Should that not also be reflected to some extent in our foreign policy by allowing these nations, some of which probably think they're underpopulated, to pursue the type of policy that they feel is in their national interest? Do we have a right to put these kind of stringent conditions on foreign aid? Isn't there a human rights aspect to this thing which is avoided in the legislation?
There has been strong bipartisan support for a number of years for the notion that our foreign aid dollars ought to be used to try to stabilize population growth. Indeed, countries have pledged to do this under the United Nations, a particular resolution that was adopted at the United Nations. The United Nations and the world community will come together in Cairo in September of this year to reaffirm our commitment, and the United States is going to be a leader in this regard. You will see this reflected again in the President's budget when it is submitted. We believe that we should be providing family planning services and an array of other services and programs that will help people to control the size of their families. This is also what I would call a human right, that they have a right to be able to space their children and a right to determine the size of the family so that they will have enough food on the table to feed them. There is a very serious problem that is on the horizon here with respect to food security. We are now seeing the leveling of food production in the world as the population increases. This is contributing to instability. It's a major part of our foreign policy to try to encourage stability, and that means that we have to deal with this population growth problem.
Family planning is one thing, but isn't it another thing in restricting arbitrarily the growth of a population in particular nations, which perhaps, like in Africa, are relatively underpopulated compared to, say, the United States?
I just do not accept the word arbitrarily. Our programs are based on voluntarism, based on the concept of choice. There is a tremendous unmet need for family planning services in the world. That implies that people voluntarily wish to participate in our programs.
Budget that will be announced next week, you indicated that there will be no change in the aids going to Egypt and Israel. But what about after 1995? According to this new direction, you're gonna see any change in that down the line?
There is no change in the policy of the United States from the way we implemented that policy under the old act. We will look at the situation, and I believe, will maintain our commitment. I hope that there is a comprehensive peace in the Middle East so that we can see how we can more effectively expend our development assistance in the region.
Can you give us an example of how the new budget approach will affect a region or a type of country to either get more money or less money from the United States than the old budget approach? Give us something.
I think the most significant thing that is reflected here is that there is a requirement that we look at whether or not recipient nations are good partners of the United States in the development process. There was a major reform already announced when we announced the closure of 21 of our field missions. A good percentage of those 21 missions were in countries that were not good partners of the United States in the development process. They were not performing. Their per capita incomes were going down, and primarily as a result of human rights abuses, a lack of interest in democracy, and most importantly, a lack of interest in allowing their own people to participate in the development process. That philosophy that was expressed as we close the missions is reflected as well in this bill, and it will mean, if we get this approved by Congress, that Congress and the executive agree on that approach to foreign aid.
Is there any indication in this bill that earmarking will not continue? Is there any prohibition against earmarking in this bill? And if will it continue? Won't it continue as a practical matter?
We're not going to set a standard for ourselves that we will not have succeeded if we don't get all earmarks out. That is too high a standard. It's quite clear that there would be an interest in some cases in earmarking. We think that it's, especially in bad budget times, it forces us to take actions that are not necessarily in our foreign policy interest. It is not the right way to do development, and we've tried to make a case that integrated strategic approach to development makes more sense than earmarking. We'll see whether we succeed in that. I expect there will be a few earmarks, but we will fight against each of them.
South America will be hardest hit, or hit hard, by the new aid bill. What do you tell those countries to explain why they're being cut so much?
Oh, this is precisely inaccurate in the sense that while Latin America as a whole may be cut, we're going to be able to focus our resources a lot better, and certainly Central America continues to be a very high priority. We're also moving our aid program from concessional grant program to a credit and loan program, and into a trade relationship that we think will help the development process in the region.
Given the number of modifications that have been made so far since the original idea and since you came to office, how closely does this bill reflect your original goals for AID, and how do you rate the chances of it succeeding in Congress without major changes that would modify your original goals?
Well, we started the process with a draft bill that was probably a little unrealistic, but this is part of a negotiating process. We feel very good about the bill that we presented today. We got some indications of concern about certain provisions. We're prepared to work with the Congress on this. The most important thing this bill does is to change the relationship that the executive branch has with the Congress on development programs. Instead of giving us 75 different mandates downtown, we're asking them to fund these 6 provisions plus within sustainable development 4 major goals. We're asking them to hold us accountable on the basis of results as opposed to the input of resources into various things. Summarized best perhaps by saying that at the end of the year, instead of asking us how much money we spent on child survival, they will ask us how many children did we save. That is what is crucial about this bill and what it does to the congressional executive relationship.